Welcome, the Dweller of the Dark. We are a channel honoring the yellowed and blackened bones of many prominent authors. We will be digging up several obscure, strange, and forgotten authors who influenced many of the great horror, science fiction, and fantasy writers today. Comment below if you like. If you have authors that you'd like to see recognized, list them in the comments or contact our author page. Subscribe for more tales of the horrifying, obscure, strange, and forgotten. We'll have quite a collection climbing out of the tombs. If you like any of our tales, comment, ring the bell, and crush the like button below. Unknown Horror Masters. The Skull and Bones collection has risen from the grave. More beasts to be released soon. Find us on Fiverr to raise 7 kinds of hell. Check out our other stories on our websites. YouTube, BitChute, Rumble, Dweller of the Dark. Official website, dwellerofthedark.com. Kindle Vella, new serialized novels and novelette. Weekly new episodes. Check out links below for Where the Wolf Dwells. The Curious Death of Dionysus Shall-Not. Our books and ebooks are on Kindle Amazon. Follow, support us on Twitter, Instagram, Patreon, Bandcamp. Dweller of the Dark. Children of Horror. Legion of Ghouls. Tonight, we continue our celebration of Halloween. Each night, we will be presenting tales of the best Halloween horrors ever conjured to terrify, haunt, and delight. Heather Ale by Robert Louis Stevenson. First published in 1890 for Ballads of Robert Louis Stevenson. From the bonny bells of Heather, they brewed a drink long syne, was sweeter far than honey, was stronger far than wine. They brewed it, and they drank it, and lay in a blessed swound for days and days together in their dwellings underground. There rose a king in Scotland, a fell man to his foes. He smote the Picts in battle. He hunted them like roes. Over miles of the Red Mountain, he hunted as they fled, and strewed the dwarfish bodies of the dying and the dead. Summer came in the country. Red was the heather bell, but the manner of the brewing was none alive to tell. And graves that were like children's on many a mountain head, the brewsters of the heather lay numbered with the dead. The king in the red moorland rode on a summer's day, and the bees hummed, and the curlews cried beside the way. The king rode and was angry. Black was his brow and pale, to rule in a land of heather, and lack the heather ale. It fortuned that his vassals, riding free on the heath, came on a stone that was fallen, and vermin hid beneath. Rudely plucked from their hiding, never a word they spoke. A son and his aged father, last of the dwarfish folk. The king sat high on his charger. He looked on the little men, and the dwarfish and swarthy couple looked at the king again. Down by the shore he had them, and there on the giddy brink, I will give you life, ye vermin, for the secret of the drink. There stood the son and father, and they looked high and low. The heather was red around them, the sea rumbled below, and up and spoke the father. Shrill was his voice to hear.
I have a word in private, a word for the royal ear. Life is dear to the aged, and honor a little thing. I would gladly sell the secret,
quoth the Pict to the king. His voice was small as a sparrow's, and shrill and wonderful clear.
I would gladly sell my secret, only my son I fear. For life is a little matter, and death is naught to the young, and I dare not sell my honor under the eye of my son. Take him, O king, and bind him, and cast him far in the deep, and it's I will tell the secret that I have sworn to keep.
They took the son and bound him, neck and heels in a thong. And a lad took him and swung him, and flung him far and strong. And the sea swallowed his body like that of a child of 10. And there on the cliff stood the father, last of the dwarfish men.
True was the word I told you. Only my son I feared. For I doubt the sapling courage that goes without the beard. But now in vain is the torture. Fire shall never avail. Here dies in my bosom the secret of heather ale.
The Music on the Hill by Saki. First published in the Chronicles of Clovis, 1911. Sylvia Seltoun ate her breakfast in the morning room at Yezny with a pleasant sense of ultimate victory, such as a fervent Ironside might have permitted himself on the morrow of Worcester fight. She was scarcely pugnacious by temperament, but belonged to that more successful class of fighters who are pugnacious by circumstance. Fate had willed that her life should be occupied with a series of small struggles, usually with the odds slightly against her, and usually she had just managed to come through winning. And now she felt that she had brought her hardest and certainly her most important struggle to a successful issue. To have married Mortimer Seltoun, dead Mortimer, as his more intimate enemies called him, in the teeth of the cold hostility of his family, and in spite of his unaffected indifference to women, was indeed an achievement that had needed some determination and adroitness to carry through. Yesterday, she had brought her victory to its concluding stage by wrenching her husband away from town and its group of satellite watering places and settling him down in the vocabulary of her kind in this remote wood-girt manor farm, which was his country house.
You will never get Mortimer to go,
his mother had said carpingly.
But if he wants goals, he'll stay. Yezny throws almost as much a spell over him as town does. One can understand what holds him little town. But Yasni?
And the dowager had shrugged her shoulders. There was a somber, almost savage wildness about Yasni that was certainly not likely to appeal to town-bred taste. And Sylvia, notwithstanding her name, was accustomed to nothing much more sylvan than leafy Kensington. She looked on the country as something excellent and wholesome in its way, which was apt to become troublesome if you encouraged it overmuch. Distrust of town life had been a new thing with her, born of her marriage with Mortimer, and she had watched with satisfaction the gradual fading of what she called the German street look in his eyes as the woods and heather of Yasni had closed in on them yesternight. Her willpower and strategy had prevailed. Mortimer would stay. Outside the morning room windows was a triangular slope of turf, which the indulgent might call a lawn, and beyond its low hedge of neglected fuchsia bushes a steeper slope of heather and bracken dropped down into cavernous combs overgrown with oak and yew. In its wild, open savagery, there seemed a stealthy linking of the joy of life with the terror of unseen things. Sylvia smiled complacently as she gazed with a School of Art appreciation at the landscape, and then of a sudden she almost shuddered.
It is very wild,
she said to Mortimer, who had joined her.
One could almost think that in such a place the worship of Pan had never quite died out.
The worship of Pan never has died out, said Mortimer. Other, newer gods have drawn aside his votaries from time to time, but he is the nature god to whom all must come back at last. He has been called the father of all the gods, but most of his children have been stillborn. Sylvia was religious in an honest, vaguely devotional kind of way, and did not like to hear her beliefs spoken of as mere aftergrowths. But it was at least something new and hopeful to hear dead Mortimer speak with such energy and conviction on any subject.
You don't really believe in Pan?
She asked incredulously. I've been a fool in most things, said Mortimer quietly. But I'm not such a fool as not to believe in Pan when I'm down here. And if you're wise, you won't disbelieve in him too boastfully while you're in his country. It was not till a week later, when Sylvia had exhausted the attractions of the woodland walks round Yasni, that she ventured on a tour of inspection of the farm buildings A farmyard suggested in her mind a scene of cheerful bustle, with churns and flails, and smiling dairymaids, and teams of horses drinking knee-deep in duck-crowded ponds. As she wandered among the gaunt gray buildings of Yesney Manor Farm, her first impression was one of crushing stillness and desolation, as though she had happened on some lone, deserted homestead, long given over to owls and cobwebs. Then came a sense of furtive, watchful hostility, the same shadow of unseen things that seemed to lurk in the wooded combs and coppices. From behind heavy doors and shuttered windows came the restless stomp of hoof or rasp of chain halter, and at times a muffled bellow from some stalled beast. From a distant corner, a shaggy dog watched her with intent, unfriendly eyes. As she drew near, it slipped quietly into its kennel and slipped out again as noiselessly when she had passed by. A few hens, questing for food under a rick, stole away under a gate at her approach. Sylvia felt that if she had come across any human beings in this wilderness of barn and byre, they would have fled wraith-like from her gaze. At last, turning a corner quickly, she came upon a living thing that did not fly from her. A stretch in a pool of mud was an enormous sow, gigantic beyond the town woman's wildest computation of swine flesh, and speedily alert to resent and, if necessary, repel the unwanted intrusion. It was Sylvia's turn to make an unobtrusive retreat. As she threaded her way past rickyards and cowsheds and long blank walls, she started suddenly at a strange sound. The echo of a boy's laughter, golden and equivocal. Jan, the only boy employed on the farm, a tow-headed, wizen-faced yokel, was visibly at work on a potato clearing halfway up the nearest hillside, and Mortimer, when questioned, knew of no other probable or possible begetter of the hidden mockery that had ambushed Sylvia's retreat. The memory of that untraceable echo was added to her other impressions of a furtive, sinister something that hung around Yesney. Of Mortimer, she saw very little. Farm and woods and trout streams seemed to swallow him up from dawn till dusk. Once, following the direction she had seen him take in the morning, she came to an open space in a nut copse, further shut in by huge yew trees, in the center of which stood a stone pedestal surmounted by a small bronze figure of a youthful pine. It was a beautiful piece of workmanship, but her attention was chiefly held by the fact that a newly cut bunch of grapes had been placed as an offering at its feet. Grapes were none too plentiful at the manor house, and Sylvia snatched the bunch angrily from the pedestal. Contemptuous annoyance dominated her thoughts as she strolled slowly homeward, and then gave way to a sharp feeling of something that was very near fright. Across a thick tangle of undergrowth, a boy's face was scowling at her, brown and beautiful, with unutterably evil eyes. It was a lonely pathway. All pathways round Yesney were lonely, for the matter of that. And she sped forward without waiting to give a closer scrutiny to this sudden apparition. It was not till she had reached the house that she discovered that she had dropped the bunch of grapes in her flight.
I saw a youth in the wood today,
she told Mortimer that evening.
Brown-faced and rather handsome, but a scoundrel to look at. A gypsy lad, I suppose.
A reasonable theory, said Mortimer. Only there aren't any gypsies in these parts at present.
Then who was he?
Asked Sylvia, and as Mortimer appeared to have no theory of his own, she passed on to recount her finding of the votive offering.
I suppose it was your doing,
she observed.
It's a harmless piece of lunacy, but people would think you dreadfully silly if they knew of it.
Did you meddle with it in any way? Asked Mortimer.
I threw the grapes away. It seemed so silly,
said Sylvia, watching Mortimer's impassive face for a sign of annoyance. I don't think you were wise to do that, he said reflectively. I've heard it said that the wood gods are rather horrible to those who molest them.
Horrible, perhaps, to those that believe in them, but you see, I don't,
retorted Sylvia. All the same, said Mortimer in his even, dispassionate tone, I should avoid the woods and orchards if I were you, and give a wide berth to the horned beast on the farm. It was all nonsense, of course, but in that lonely, wood-girt spot, nonsense seemed able to rear a bastard brood of uneasiness.
Mortimer,
said Sylvia suddenly,
I think we will go back to town sometime soon.
Her victory had not been so complete as she had supposed. It had carried her on to ground that she was already anxious to quit. I don't think you will ever go back to town, said Mortimer. He seemed to be paraphrasing his mother's prediction as to himself. Sylvia noted with dissatisfaction and some self-contempt that the course of her next afternoon's ramble took her instinctively clear of the network of woods. As to the horned cattle, Mortimer's warning was scarcely needed, for she had always regarded them as of doubtful neutrality at the best. Her imagination unsexed the most matronly dairy cows and turned them into bulls liable to see red at any moment. The ram who fed in the narrow paddock below the orchards she had adjudged, after ample and cautious probation, to be of docile temper. Today, however, she decided to leave his docility untested, for the usually tranquil beast was roaming with every sign of restlessness from corner to corner of his meadow. A low, fitful piping as of some reedy flute was coming from the depth of a neighboring copse, and there seemed to be some subtle connection between the animals' restless pacing and the wild music from the wood. Sylvia turned her steps in an upward direction and climbed the heather-clad slopes that stretched in rolling shoulders high above Yesney. She had left the piping notes behind her, but across the wooded combs at her feet, the wind brought her another kind of music, the straining bay of hounds in full chase. Yesney was just on the outskirts of the Devon and Somerset country, and the hunted deer sometimes came that way. Sylvia could presently see a dark body resting hill after hill and sinking again and again out of sight as he crossed the combs, while behind him steadily swelled that relentless chorus, and she grew tense with the excited sympathy that one feels for any hunted thing in whose capture one is not directly interested. And at last he broke through the outermost line of oak scrub and fern and stood panting in the open, a fat September stag carrying a well-furnished head. His obvious course was to drop down to the brown pools of Undercombe and thence make his way towards the red deer's favored sanctuary, the sea. To Sylvia's surprise, however, he turned his head to the upland slope and came lumbering resolutely onward over the heather. It will be dreadful, she thought. The hounds will pull him down under my very eyes. But the music of the pack seemed to have died away for a moment, and in its place she heard again that wild piping which rose now on this side, now on that, as though urging the failing stag to a final effort. Sylvia stood well aside from his path, half hidden in a thick growth of whortle bushes, and watched him swing stiffly upward, his flanks dark with sweat, the coarse hairs on his neck showing light by contrast. The pipe music shrilled suddenly around her, seeming to come from the bushes at her very feet, and at the same moment the great beast slewed round and bore directly down upon her. In an instant her pity for the hunted animal was changed to wild terror at her own danger. The thick heather roots mocked her scrambling efforts at flight, and she looked frantically downward for a glimpse of oncoming hounds. The huge, antler spikes were within a few yards of her, and in a flash of numbing fear, she remembered Mortimer's warning to beware of horned beast on the farm. And then, with a quick throb of joy, she saw that she was not alone. A human figure stood a few paces aside, knee-deep in the whortle bushes. "Drive it off!" she shrieked, but the figure made no answering movement. The antlers drove straight at her breast. The acrid smell of the hunted animal was in her nostrils, but her eyes were filled with the horror of something she saw other than her oncoming death. And in her ears rang the echo of a boy's laughter, golden and equivocal. The Little People, by Robert E. Howard, first written in 1930. My sister threw down the book she was reading. To be exact, she threw it at me. "Foolishness," said she. "Fairy tales. Hand me that copy of Michael Arlen." I did so mechanically, glancing at the volume which had incurred her youthful displeasure. The story was The Shining Pyramid by Arthur Machen. "My dear girl," said I, "this is a masterpiece of outre literature." "Yes, but the idea," she answered. "I outgrew fairy tales when I was 10. This tale is not intended as an exponent of common-day realism," I explained patiently. "Too far-fetched," she said with the finality of 17. "I like to read about things that could happen. Who were the little people he speaks of? The same old elf and troll business?" "All legends have a base of fact," I said. "There is a reason." "You mean to tell me such things actually existed?" she exclaimed. "Rot!" "Not so fast, young lady," I admonished, slightly nettled. "I mean that all myths had a concrete beginning, which was later changed and twisted so as to take on a supernatural significance. Young people," I continued, bending a brotherly frown on her pouting lips, "have a way of either accepting entirely or rejecting entirely such things as they do not understand. The little people spoken of by Machen are supposed to be descendants of the prehistoric people who inhabited Europe before the Celts came down out of the north. They are known variously as Turanians, Picts, Mediterraneans, and garlic eaters, a race of small, dark people. Traces of their type may be found in primitive sections of Europe and Asia today, among the Basque of Spain, the Scotch of Galloway, and the Lats. They were workers in flint and are known to anthropologists as men of the Neolithic or polished Stone Age. Relics of their age show plainly that they had reached a comparatively high stage of primitive culture by the beginning of the Bronze Age, which was ushered in by the ancestors of the Celts, our prehistoric tribesmen, young lady. These destroyed or enslaved the Mediterranean peoples and were in turn ousted by the Teutonic tribes all over Europe, and especially in Britain. The legend is that these Picts, whom the Celts looked upon as scarcely human, fled to caverns under the earth and lived there, coming out only at night, when they would burn, murder, and carry off children for their bloody rites of worship. Doubtless, there was much in this theory. Descendants of cave people, these fleeing dwarfs, would no doubt take refuge in caverns and, no doubt, managed to live undiscovered for generations. That was a long time ago, she said with slight interest. If there ever were any of those people, they're dead now. Why, we're right in the country where they're supposed to perform and haven't seen any signs of them. I nodded. My sister Joan did not react to the weird West Country as I did. The immense menhirs and cromlechs which rose starkly upon the moors seemed to bring back vague racial memories, stirring my Celtic imagination. Maybe, I said, adding unwisely, you heard what that old villager said? The warning about walking on the fen at night. No one does it. You're very sophisticated, young lady, but I'll bet you wouldn't spend a night alone in that stone ruin we can see from my window. Down came her book, and her eyes sparkled with interest and combat.
I'll do it, she exclaimed. I'll show you. He did say no one would go near those old rocks at night, didn't he? I will, and stay there the rest of the night.
She was on her feet instantly, and I saw I had made a mistake. No, you won't either, I vetoed. What would people think?
What do I care what they think?
She retorted in the up-to-date spirit of the younger generation. You haven't any business out on the moors at night, I answered. Granting that these old myths are so much empty wind, there are plenty of shady characters who wouldn't hesitate to harm a helpless girl. It's not safe for a girl like you to be out unprotected.
You mean I'm too pretty?
She asked naively. I mean you're too foolish, I answered in my best older brother manner. She made a face at me and was silent for a moment, and I, who could read her agile mind with absurd ease, could tell by her pensive features and sparkling eyes exactly what she was thinking. She was mentally surrounded by a crowd of her cronies back home, and I could guess the exact words which she was already framing.
My dears, I spent a whole night in the most romantic old ruin in West England, which was supposed to be haunted.
I silently cursed myself for bringing the subject up when she said abruptly,
I'm going to do it. Just the same. Nobody will harm me, and I wouldn't pass up the adventure for anything.
Joan, I said, I forbid you to go out alone tonight or any other night. Her eyes flashed, and I instantly wished I had couched my command in more tactful language. My sister was willful and high-spirited, used to having her way, and very impatient of restraint.
You can't order me around,
she flamed.
You've done nothing but bully me ever since we left America.
It's been necessary, I sighed. I can think of a number of pastimes more pleasant than touring Europe with a flapper sister. Her mouth opened as if to reply angrily, then she shrugged her slim shoulders and settled back down in her chair, taking up a book.
All right, I didn't want to go much anyhow,
she remarked casually. I eyed her suspiciously. She was not usually subdued so easily. In fact, some of the most harrowing moments of my life have been those in which I was forced to cajole and coax her out of a rebellious mood. Nor was my suspicion entirely vanquished when a few moments later she announced her intention of retiring and went to her room just across the corridor. I turned out the light and stepped over to my window, which opened upon a wide view of the barren, undulating waste of the moor. The moon was just rising, and the land glimmered grisly and stark beneath its cold beams. It was late summer, and the air was warm, yet the whole landscape looked cold, bleak, and forbidding. Across the fen I saw rise, stark and shadowy, the rough and mighty spires of the ruins. Gaunt and terrible they loomed against the night, silent phantoms from the past. Sleep did not come to me at once, however, for I was hurt at my sister's evident resentment, and I lay for a long time, brooding and staring at the window, now framed boldly in the molten silver of the moon. At length, I dropped into a troubled slumber through which flitted vague dreams wherein dim, ghostly shapes glided and leered. I awoke suddenly, sat up, and stared about me wildly, striving to orient my muddled senses. An oppressive feeling as of impending evil hovered about me. Fading swiftly as I came to full consciousness, lurked the eerie remembrance of a hazy dream, wherein a white fog had floated through the window and had assumed the shape of a tall, white-bearded man who had shaken my shoulder as if to arouse me from sleep. All of us are familiar with the curious sensations of waking from a bad dream, the dimming and dwindling of partly remembered thoughts, and feelings. But the wider awake I became, the stronger grew the suggestion of evil. I sprang up, snatched on my clothing, and rushed to my sister's room, flung open the door. The room was unoccupied. I raced down the stair and accosted the night clerk, who was maintained by the small hotel for some obscure reason. "Miss Costigan, sir?" She came down, clad for outdoors, a while after midnight, about half an hour ago, sir, and said she was going to take a stroll on the moor, and not to be alarmed if she did not return at once, sir. I hurled out of the hotel, my pulse pounding a devil's tattoo. Far out across the fen, I saw the ruins, bold and grim against the moon, and in that direction I hastened. At length, it seemed hours, I saw a slim figure some distance in front of me. The girl was taking her time, and in spite of her start of me, I was gaining. Soon I would be within hearing distance. My breath was already coming in gasps from my exertions, but I quickened my pace. The aura of the fin was like a tangible something pressing upon me, weighting my limbs, and always that presentiment of evil grew and grew. Then, far ahead of me, I saw my sister stop suddenly and look about her confusedly. The moonlight flung a veil of illusion. I could see her, but I could not see what had caused her sudden terror. I broke into a run, my blood leaping wildly and suddenly freezing as a wild, despairing scream burst out and sent the moor echoes flying. The girl was turning first one way and then another, and I screamed for her to run toward me. She heard me and started toward me, running like a frightened antelope, and then I saw vague shadows darted about her, short, dwarfish shapes. Just in front of me rose a solid wall of them, and I saw that they had blocked her from gaining to me. Suddenly, instinctively, I believe, she turned and raced for the stone columns, the whole horde after her, save those who remained to bar my path. I had no weapon, nor did I feel the need of any. A strong, athletic youth, I was, in addition, an amateur boxer of ability, with a terrific punch in either hand. Now, all the primal instincts surged redly within me. I was a caveman bent on vengeance against a tribe who sought to steal a woman of my family. I did not fear. I only wished to close with them. I recognized these. I knew them of old, and all the old wars rose and roared within the misty caverns of my soul. Hate leaped in me, as in the old days when men of my blood came from the north. Though the whole spawn of hell rise up from those caverns which honeycomb the moors. Now I was almost upon those who barred my way. I saw plainly the stunted bodies, the gnarled limbs, the snake-like beady eyes that stared unwinkingly, the grotesque square faces with their unhuman features, the shimmer of flint daggers in their crooked hands. Then, with a tigerish leap, I was among them like a leopard among jackals, and details were blotted out in a whirling red haze. Whatever they were of living substance. Features crumpled and bones shattered beneath my flailing fist, and blood darkened the moon-silvered stones. A flint dagger sank hilt deep in my thigh. Then the ghastly throng broke each way and fled before me, as their ancestors fled before mine, leaving 4 silent dwarfish shapes stretched on the moor. Heedless of my wounded leg, I took up the grim race anew. Joan had reached the druidic ruins now, and she leaned against one of the columns, exhausted, blindly seeking their protection in obedience to some dim instinct, just as women of her blood had done in bygone ages. The horrid things that pursued her were closing in upon her. They would reach her before I. God knows, the thing was horrible enough, but back in the recesses of my mind, grimmer horrors were whispering. Dream memories wherein stunted creatures pursued white-limbed women across such fens as these. Lurking memories of the ages when dawns were young and men struggled with forces which were not of men. The girl toppled forward in a faint and lay at the foot of the towering column in a piteous white heap. And they closed in. What they would do I knew not, but the ghost of ancient memory whispered that they would do something of hideous evil, something foul and grim. From my lips burst a scream, wild and inarticulate, born of sheer elemental horror and despair. I could not reach her before those fiends had worked their frightful will upon her. The centuries, the ages swept back. This was as it had been in the beginning, and what followed, I know not how to explain, but I think that wild shriek whispered back down the long reaches of time to the beings my ancestors worshipped, and that blood answered blood. Aye, such a shriek as could echo down the dusty corridors of lost ages and bring back from the whispering abyss of eternity the ghost of the only one who could save a girl of Celtic blood. The foremost of the things were almost upon the prostrate girl. Their hands were clutching for her when suddenly beside her a form stood. There was no gradual materializing. The figure leaped suddenly into being, etched bold and clear in the moonlight. A tall, white-bearded man, clad in long robes. The man I had seen in my dream. A druid answering once more the desperate need of people of his race. His brow was high and noble, his eyes mystic and far-seeing. So much I could see, even from where I ran. His arm rose in an imperious gesture, and the thing shrank. Back, back, back! They broke and fled, vanishing suddenly, and I sank to my knees beside my sister, gathering the child into my arms. A moment I looked up at the man, sword and shield against the powers of darkness, protecting helpless tribes as in the world's youth, who raised his hand above us as if in benediction. Then he too vanished suddenly, and the moor lay bare and silent.
The Seal of the Satyr by Robert Bloch. Roger Talquist had always known that he would return to Greece. The spell laid upon him in childhood had lingered through the years. After his father had brought him back to school in England, he never could forget the beauty of the ancient hills, of which the shepherd poets sang. Talquist's later career in archaeology emphasized the hold of the pagan on his soul. He dreamed of purple hills and marble ruins gleaming beneath an age-yellowed ivory moon. It was inevitable that he returned, and when the Oxonian expedition went to excavate a temple of Poseidon, he accompanied it to the land of his boyhood. Once arrived, his interest in the work itself slackened. He did his routine duties diffidently and spent all of his free time wandering through the wild country beyond the seaport of Milanos. A short walk would bring him to the mystic hills and the shadowed treelands. His imagination quickened in the forest silence as he mused on the old lore of paganism he'd heard from peasants. Dryads dwelt in the woods, and harpies hovered. Skyways beckoned Roger Talquist to climb the green-studded stairs of the mountains, until, from some lofty eminence, he could gaze down on the plains where once lambs had gambled to the fabled piping of the goat god. It pleased him to have believed the ancient legends, and he decided to compile a monograph on local superstition. Here the rustics still knew the myths of Pan and the forest spirits. Talquist spoke Greek fluently, and the natives made him welcome in their simple cottages while they told of forgotten lore. And here Roger Talquist met old Papa Lepolus, a tall, patriarchal oldster with the wrinkled, august face of some Cretan sea king. Papa Lepolus promised the dark, gray-eyed scientist an actual glimpse of an altar where his people had once worshipped the gods of the forest. It was an ancient place in the forest, a grotto where primitive folk had paid worship to the nature gods in olden days before the recording of history. Here were ruins that only a few knew about. The grotto was kept secret now that the Greek Orthodox Church held sway. Here were stones and carvings which might interest an archaeologist greatly, Papa Lepolus told him. "Take me there," Talquist said eagerly. "I must see this grotto." Lepolus grew silent, stroked his beard, then scowled. "I wonder if I dare, Mr. Talquist." "Dare?" Talquist exclaimed. "You and I, we are modern men. We do not fear what the ignorant peasants hereabouts still tremble before. They are afraid? But what is there for them to fear?" Lepolus stared at the floor. "Nothing, perhaps. But in that grotto, there is an altar where once men bowed to Pan.
and they did more than that. Talquist listened eagerly. Yes, Lepulus went on, if legends are to be believed, worshippers did a great deal more than bow. They gave sacrifices. You mean animals? No, Mr. Talquist. I do not mean animals. The forest gods desired things of men, the warm, living flesh of young maidens, and youth sated their divine appetites. Talquist smiled tolerantly. Well, what of it? Human beings were sacrificed in groves thousands of years ago. So what? I've heard of such things, of course. Surely today there's nothing to fear because once blood was spilled. But you do not understand, my friend. Do you know why there were such sacrifices? What the ancients believed? No, Talquist admitted. The old man whispered through his beard. They said that the gods appeared in human form at certain times, and at other times in the shapes of beasts. Shepherds and wandering maidens met the old nature gods on lonely hills. And later, there were satyrs and fauns, half beast, half human. Oh, I know of such myths, Lepulus. Satyrs, centaurs, goat-headed men tumble all over themselves in Greek mythology. So what? These creatures had divine blood in them, Mr. Talquist, and as such, they did not die. Talquist's eyes widened. What? You mean that you're afraid the forest and the altar are, perhaps, guarded by fabled monsters? No, nothing as childish as that, the old man reproved. Talquist wondered whether he went sincere in his denial. And what bothers you, Lepulus? Only this. When the ancients made sacrifice on the altar, they received gifts in return. Do you understand? They gave blood, and the gods gave gifts in exchange. Terrible gifts, Mr. Talquist. Talquist stared at the old man. What do you mean? I cannot say exactly. Worshippers wanted things from the gods. They wanted the immortality that fauns and satyrs and dryads received. So sometimes the gods would leave tokens and amulets. Those that wore them were supposed to be changed. Talquist was scornful. Are you trying to tell me that you believe such? No, not exactly, Papa Lepulus replied slowly. Then take me to the altar, the young scientist insisted. The old man's eyes avoided Talquist's face. I do not show people the grotto, he mumbled. It is a secret in our family. Better not to know some things. I was a fool to suggest it. Talquist made a little pile of drachmas on the table. Lepulus looked at the coins, shuffled his feet in silence. Then he smiled. I am an old man, Mr. Talquist, an old, tired man. It is hard for me to travel, but I will lead you to the altar in the forest if you wish. Talquist smiled patiently. Tomorrow? Tomorrow. It was a strange pair that set out the next day through the woodland pathways. Tall, bearded Papa Lepulus, in his ragged robes, led the trimly dressed Roger Talquist through the dense semi-twilight. As they walked along, the trees, shrubbery, and vines grew thicker and more tangled. The sun shone through in only a few spots. At first, Talquist had followed the old man along a definite path, where birds sang gaily from the branches. Now they plunged deeper into the greenish darkness between twisting trees, and there was no life here, only a palpitant stillness. The stillness was of the ancient past. This was the deep forest of an older Greece, undisturbed through 3,000 years. Here centaurs pranced and whinnied beside the dark streams, and dryads capered upon cloud-crowned hilltops to the sound of hidden lutes. So Talquist imagined. He thought musingly of the myths told him by the oldster. They seemed appropriate enough now in this setting. Lepidus plodded ahead silently, almost furtively. Now that he had embarked on the trip, it seemed he did not relish this journey. Talquist noticed how the oldster kept peering over his shoulder toward the silent trees. Lepidus seemed frightened. It was almost as though he believed the fantastic fables of which he had spoken. Through deep glades and great lonely swamps they toiled, and again Talquist marveled that the old man did not lose his way in the trackless marshes. But at last they took a winding trail which led through a thicket and into a sunken grove, bordered by a land of tree-guarded twilight. Roger Talquist gazed in silence at their goal. His eyes noted the great grassy ring in the center of the low grade, and he saw that the crumbled stones surrounded it in a sort of half-imaginary pattern. It was a moot question whether these rocks had been naturally or artificially placed. If the latter, they had been laid at a time incredibly remote. But they did resemble a crude altar circle, and the great stone in the middle might easily have served the purpose of a sacrificial slab. They descended upon the grotto, and then Talquist took the lead while his aged guide hung back. Talquist examined the stones and noted the faint, rusty stains still visible on their tops. He fumbled amidst the fragments of broken rock that littered the bases of the altars in search of some ancient token or relic. And then Roger Talquist saw. The grass was damp and pressed down. The earth was wet. And in a circle about the central altar were the unmistakable imprints of hoofs. Talquist gasped. "Come here, Lepidus," he exclaimed. The old man looked down at the hoof marks, clear and fresh. He smiled unfathomably. "I warned you, Mr. Talquist. There are creatures who seek this lonely altar." "Nonsense," he stammered. "I merely wanted to ask you about wild goats. Are there any that might graze here?" The old man's smile was more enigmatic still. "Wild goats?" he said. "Look again, Mr. Talquist. These are not goat tracks." Talquist looked, and they were not goat tracks, these great hoof imprints in the earth. But they had to be. Why was Lepidus laughing so? "I warned you, Talquist," the old man went on. "I told you about what lurks, still undying, in the forest. I told you how my family knows, has always known and guarded the secret of the ancient faith. I told you how one can sacrifice on this altar and receive a gift from the gods, a gift of eternal life and power. For the gods send a token conferring their reward upon the sacrifice. It is not pleasant to live in a changed shape, perhaps, but it is better than dying." What was the old fool raving about? Had he gone stark mad? Lepidus' voice was shrill now. "I warned you, remember that! I tried to keep you from coming, but you insisted. I am weak, I know. Weak because I am old, and do not want to die. I'm afraid to die. I would far rather live, even in changed shape. And so, Mr. Roger Talquist, now that we are at the altar, the time has come. It came then, so swiftly that Talquist was caught wholly unprepared. Even as he was speaking, Lepidus edged closer and closer. Then suddenly, from out of one ragged sleeve, a knife flashed. Lepidus raised the gleaming blade on high and brought it down in a vicious stroke. Talquist dodged desperately aside, just in time. But the old man, laughing insanely, was gripping him harshly by the throat. The knife raised again, and Talquist was forced back against the altar stone. The blade trembled, Lepidus tightened his grip, and Talquist knew with an icy heart that he must die. With the strength of panic, Roger Talquist raised his free arm and caught the old man's wrist. He lunged forward, twisting Lepidus against the stone, and then wrestled with the mad strength of the shrieking patriarch. The knife bit keenly several times as Lepidus stabbed futilely again and again. "Oh, great Pan, aid me!" screamed the old man. And then Talquist twisted the wiry wrist just as the blade thrust downward, and it turned. The knife buried itself inches deep in Lepidus's wrinkled throat, and a red stream poured out over the altar top as the coughing ancient fell in racking death upon it. Talquist stepped back aghast. The hysteria of the last few moments had left him dazed. The earth seemed to spin around him madly. The stones moved, the darkness deepened, and in his wild fancy, Talquist heard the rumbling of thunder from beneath his feet. Then the shock was all over, and he stared mutely at the dead man on the altar. Lepidus had lured him here, believing in the myths he had himself revealed. He had tried to kill the young scientist on the altar, that he might receive the gift of eternal life, though in a changed shape from the ancient gods. Lepidus had been mad. It was all a most unfortunate occurrence. Talquist turned. He must find his way out of the forest, and quickly. But what was this? In the shards at his feet, at the base of the altar, something glinted dully. Talquist stooped and picked it up. Funny. He hadn't noticed this when searching before. He held it against the light of the blood-red sunset. It was an octagonally cut medallion of greenish stone, so worn and polished as to hint of extreme age. The medallion was fastened on a linked chain of true gold and was evidently designed to be worn around the neck. All this Talquist observed in a fleeting moment, for his eyes and thoughts were directed now on the startling figure emblazoned on the face of the amulet. There was something about the technique of the design that puzzled Talquist, even while it disturbed him. The lines did not seem as though executed by human thought. Each artist puts into his work something of himself, and what the designer had put into this figure was horribly alien. The goat seemed to be a symbol of another figure underneath. A figure Talquist couldn't make out, but which he knew instinctively was lurking there. The metal was of a peculiar luster. The carving was unnatural, and looking at the thing somehow shocked Talquist. The goat was the symbol of Pan, and perhaps the wild ravings of Lepidus, with his talk of gifts from forest gods, had unnerved the scientist. Roger Talquist stared at the evil figure as he absently fastened the golden chain about his neck. With a start, he realized what he was doing. Why had he put the amulet on? He raised his hand to remove it, and as he touched the stone, he received a second shock. The stone was quite warm. There was a tingling in Talcus's fingertips, a tingling not altogether unpleasant. The stone was radiant and warm as ardent flesh, as though it possessed some radioactive properties. In a second, the sensation passed, and Talcus was brought sharply back to reality. A breeze now curled out of the encroaching night. The twilight grove was eerie, and the trees were fantastic figures bowing in the wind. They stretched long green arms as though to bar the wanderer's path. For a moment, Talcus had the absurd notion that these trees would conspire to keep him in the forest. He looked again at the dead man on the altar, then glanced down at the horrible, unexplained tracks at his feet and shivered. He must get out of this grotto. Talcus started across the grove to the thicket. Halfway across, the last red rays of sunlight glinted on his chest, and he glanced down again to see the amulet moving in a slow arc. He touched it, and a painful shock stabbed his fingertips again. Once more he knew fear, because now he felt life pulsing in the stone. It was living animation he felt, the sensation of powerful forces running in waves through his hand and up the length of his arm. The contact somehow invigorated Talcus. He looked at the carved figure of the prancing goat that blazed up, and his eyes smarted and burned. The same eerie force tingling through his fingers now seemed to dance into his eyes and into the brain behind them. There was a force in the stone. Lepidus, with his wild talk of a change in the men who found the gifts of the old gods. Lord, could the fool have been speaking the truth? After all, Lepidus had been killed, though not intentionally, on that altar like a sacrifice. Whereas the old man had meant to sacrifice Talcus and receive in reward the grant of immortality, though he would be changed in some indefinable way by the divine blood of satyrs. But Lepidus had died, and then Talcus had found this peculiar talisman. Odd that he hadn't seen it before when he searched. Had it been sent after the sacrifice? That thunder from below his feet. Oh, that was absurd. There were no forest gods in this 20th century. Hoofprints in the grass. Talcus tried to think of something else. Paradoxically enough, that was simple. His own body. Why was he suddenly feeling so strange? He had a sudden impulse to tear the amulet from his throat, and his fingers instinctively tightened about it. There came a rapid acceleration of that flowing force within him, so that his arms seemed numb, as though from an electric shock. What was this terrible thing doing to him? Changing him? God. His body did ache. His arms and legs burned. There were sharp twinges in his thighs as he stumbled on, the kind of stabbing throb which in childhood had been spoken of as growing pains. Growing pains? In a sort of panic, Talcus tried desperately to be sane. It was rheumatism. That's what it was. He had caught a chill in the damp and dew of the woods. His legs hurt from walking in tight boots. He loosened his shirt as he walked across the glade, untied the lacings then, stopping to remove his boots. He seemed feverish. His head felt constricted, yet through the dull throbbing ran a thin red thread of exultation. He was terrified, yet strangely joyous. Fever? Perhaps. His body, despite the pain, no longer seemed a part of him. He stroked his brow, and he scarcely recognized the convolutions. Feeling the stubble on his cheeks, he wondered if he had remembered to shave that morning. His hands were bronzed, and his fingers still tingled from the shock of the amulet. He ought not to go on. He must rest. Shirtless, barefooted, Talquas flung himself down in the shadow of a bush at the edge of the glade. The last flicker of sunset crossed his chest. His eyes focused again on the burning green brightness of the amulet, and as he stared, his whole being turned to liquid flame. He felt oddly tortured, racked. His muscles stretched, tautened, and nerves ached with an exquisite pain that was almost animal ecstasy. He could not move his eyes or raise his hand to drop the talisman and claw off the burning band of gold about his throat. Yet his brain was enthralled by a tormented bliss, though another part of his consciousness shrieked hypnotism, magnetism, madness. But his being continued to writhe in bondage to the living stone. Abruptly came the release. Dusk flooded the grove, and its purple pallor mingled oddly with the green lambency of the flaming amulet on Talquas' chest. Roger Talquas rubbed his eyes. Why was he lying here on the grass? What had he been doing? He felt no pain now, only a hot surging of blood through quickened veins. He could feel the shrill singing at his temples. Why had he wanted to run away? Why had he feared the power of the amulet? It was pleasant here in the forest at night, and the tingling in the talisman now was flowing through his body evenly in invigorating waves. Whatever the power in this seal of the satyr, be it natural or supernatural, it was good. He had been a fool to dwell on such obscure fears. Talquas rose to his feet, hardly conscious of his nakedness, and faced the edge of the grotto once again. Through the haze of dusk, he saw the standing stones shining whitely. The grass seemed greener and more lush about the bases. There seemed to be new life here. The rocks appeared larger and more numerous than in the afternoon. He soon realized that they were arranged in a circle so as to form a crude pattern. Talquas wanted to step over and examine them, but something halted him in the shadow of the bushes. From afar came the sound of conscience. Into the glade marched a small procession of bearded men robed in white. There were perhaps a dozen of them, and Talquas vaguely recognized faces from the village. Then there was still worship here. The priest, if priests they were, gathered around the central altar, and Talquas saw that they discovered the body of Lepulus with great surprise. They stood there, huddled and whispering in the twilight. He told us that the young foreigner would be ready, whispered one loudly enough for Talquas to overhear. Something has gone amiss. Let us go quickly before they assemble. Yes, they will come for the body. We will leave the incense burning here, but the talisman is already gone. Hasten, I am afraid. The men produced small bundles of sticks which they lighted on the 8 outer stones. Great clouds of perfumed smoke wafted to wooded skies. It was a scene from old Greece, the ancient Greece of mystic forest gods. The body of Lepulus lay on the central altar, and the pungent smoke rose all about him. The old men hurried off then, whispering and casting veiled glances back into the glade. Talquas crouched watching, his breathing excited and irregular. For a long moment, there was utter silence. Then began a curious rustling, a slithering of leaves upon the trees, and a purposeful padding as of hoofs upon the grass. The sun had died in fathomless crimson skies, and the moon rose from the pallid purple of the east. It shone down upon the grotto as the rustling noises increased. A silver moon shaft sped across the central altar, and as it did so, a faint, shrill peeping filled the air. Hysterically high, the treble notes sounded from far away, the peeping summons of a syrinx. The peeping blended with rustling. The spicy perfume from the fire scented the forest dark. And now other sounds were audible, queer moanings and high neighing, chirping and animal growls. Another scent, or combination of scents, mingled with the perfume. The musk-like odors of beasts and creatures of the wood. Talquas stared and saw, and nearly shrieked. For into the grove the forest creatures headed, bounding and leaping and pawing the hard-packed earth. Shaggy and manlike, the fawns capered about in the moonlight, their goatish beards wagging to their squealing laughter. Here were the living creatures of myth. Whole-bodied maenads stamped into the glade with throaty bellows of guttural mirth, shaking their hairy heads in bovine playfulness. Across the sward, the centaurs pranced, their sly, wicked faces wreathed in lustful grimace, their stallion bodies flexed with animal vigor. They snorted and reared, bringing spiked hooves down to strike fire from the altar stones. Now Talquas understood the hoof prints on the grass. Hoarse cries, the Egyptians bounded in, lifting their horrid goat heads to bleat at the moon, and stretching their shambling legs and shapeless paws in animal ecstasy as they sniffed the aromatic incense of the spice perfume. The far-off piping grew more frantic still, and the whirling forest creatures laughed more shrilly, whirled more wildly, sniffing the reek of the smoke, and bathing in moonlight as they danced and gesticulated amidst the altar stones. Talquas gasped. Fabled legends come true. He glanced down at the seal of the satyr on his breast, then looked up as a shrill screaming sounded. The living shadows of nymphs emerged from the rushes that bordered the stream within the forest. They danced over the grass and flung their wet green hair in carefree abandon as they wheeled before the beastmen. There was one green-haired creature with eyes red as blood that Roger Talquas watched closely. The strength surging in him leaped at the sight of her as she postured with the rest. Now the creatures saw what lay upon the altar top. A fawn crept close, gesturing to his less emboldened companions. One hairy paw reached out to touch the body of Lepulus. A black satyr capered before the corpse. His nostrils flared as he fumbled at the old man's beard. A centaur trotted past, so that his sweaty flanks brushed the stone. The nymphs tittered shrilly. They gathered before that inner altar, and their eyes and hands and lips caressed what lay upon it, and they laughed and bleated. When they turned away, they dragged the body with them. The piping scurried higher in its shrillness, the peeping syrinx, the scent of smoke, the shrieking laughter. These things finally made Talcus emerge from the bushes. He did not think of what he had seen. He felt only the drumming of the incredible scene in his blood, fusing his being in strange response. The dance of the forest creatures had become a pursuit, and the nymphs fled before the insane figures that scurried after them in the darkness. Hoarse screams filled the night. Then the syrinx sounded, swelled, merged into a gigantic, triumphant bleat. The horde bore the body of Lepidus into the dark forest. Talcus, his blood sweet fire, raced after the others about the altar. It was a strange madness that possessed him, that gave him a sense of curious kinship with these beings of the past. They shrieked when they saw him and pointed to the glowing green amulet on his chest, but he did not hear. His eyes were searching for a figure, the figure of the green-haired nymph with the red eyes. She saw him and turned with a mocking leer. Talcus hated the sight, but something inside him urged his body forward. He ran toward the taunting nymph. She fled in mimic dismay back into the dark groves where now the distant piping died away. Talcus ran through the forest, following the fleet wood sprite that leaped ahead, the wet green hair blending with the leaves of the livid trees. His temples burned. He gasped for breath, and his being was filled with a nameless strength. He loped after the fleeing figure, maddened by her taunting laughter that drifted back through the nighted pathways. Soon he emerged upon the bank of a little stream where now the nymphs and the nereids had returned. The fleet little creatures splashed noisily through the reeds and sank into the pool, diving beneath the rushes. None of them re-emerged. Roger Talcus, fired by his madness, leaped after the taunting figure of the nymph he pursued, and the amulet jangled against his chest on its chain. She turned suddenly on the bank and grinned up at him with slyly parted lips and tossed her snake-locked hair. Her moist, flabby hands pawed at Talcus' arms. Her red eyes were not human, and gazing into them, Talcus abruptly lost his madness and tried to push the creature away. She stepped back on the bank. Noticing the amulet on the chain, she reached for it. Talcus pushed her away again. Sniggering, the nymph reached out, a cold hand to grasp at him for support. Instead, her fingers closed about the chain. She stepped back further, clutching the green seal, and lost her balance. With a wrench, the links parted, and the nymph fell screaming into the water. The amulet in her hand described a jeweled arc, then slipped beneath the churning surface of the stream and sank. Nymph and seal of the satyr disappeared together in the pool. Roger Talcus stood on the bank, staring stupidly at the widening circles in the water. He remembered now. He was cold, naked, standing in the woods at midnight after chasing the phantoms of fever and delirium. There had been no sacrifice, no nymphs or satyrs. It had all been a dream, a delusion brought on by the peculiar hypnotic power of the amulet he had stared at when he lay down. It was gone now, that strange talisman. He had probably flung it into the water himself in a final frenzy. Well, good riddance to the cursed stone. Old Lepidus had been right, in a way. The seal of the satyr, whether a gift of the ancient gods or not, did change a person. Wearing it, Talcus had not been himself. He had become some kind of beast. His mind had undergone a peculiar change which made him feel kinship with the wild creatures of elder myth. Lepus had said that such things still existed in the forest and came forth after a sacrifice. And indeed, these things had come to pass. Poor Lepus! He had believed it all, and he wanted the amulet because he thought it would make him a forest creature that could live forever. He had wanted it enough, believed enough, to risk murder. And he was dead, and the amulet was gone. Talquist mused. Oddly enough, he had not believed the old man's tale that the amulet could change one. He should have known it was some kind of allegory. The seal caused a mental change rather than a physical one. Assuredly, it had hypnotized him into thinking his body was different. Indeed, he had felt different. Still did, in fact. Those tingling vibrations. But what was he doing here? Better go back to the hotel now and try to forget his delirium. Talquist gave a final glance at the waters of the pool, into which the amulet had been thrown. The waters were calm now, and there was a glassy reflection in the clear moonlight. Talquist saw his own reflection in the moon-flooded depths, saw himself in nature's silvery mirror. Head, forehead, face, throat, arms, body, legs. He saw them all. And then he understood the real truth of Lepus's incredible story of gifts from the gods that would change a man. He did not look long. A single moment of numbing realization, and then he leaped into the pool. Leaped straight into the deepest water, breaking with his body the mad reflection he had seen on the mirrored surface. For, staring down at himself, Roger Talquist had seen the face and the figure of the wood god Pan. Thank you for listening.